Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here because for years I have been dealing with two issues, and I had two parts of my research. One was materialist dialectics of socialist thinkers of 60s, and there I had to rely on how they use dialectics to precisely argue with positivists, the question that Alexei Penzing raised today. And another path and another Bereich, the field which I research, was performativity, was the anthropology of performing. And these two fields never came together in my head, and I really suffered with it because I couldn't connect them. And this conference enables me at least to make an effort, an attempt of it. Actually, instead of exploring dialectics or non-dialectics as problems in itself, I would check what happens to semiology, epistemology, and art when in them one witnesses either one path or another. I will try to show how dialectical proposition works in Marxist cultural studies. Then we'll touch upon the approach to meaning, to sense in dialectics and post-structuralism, then move to Deleuze's treatment of event, which reveals what exceeds dialectics in performance, then look upon performative interpretation of Cogito by Deleuze, and finally, I will try to conclude with epistemic difference between dialectics and performance. And it might seem too much, but I had to comprise these two, at first sight, incompatible fields so that the logical puzzle is somehow connected, and then we can decide whether the steps which I make are too bold. In practice, both dialectical and non-dialectical modes overlap. For example, it is usually thought that performativity in its accidentality exceeds the dialectical procedure. Yet, a very big bulk of dramaturgy or performing arts presupposes dialectical speculation. Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be, or Beethoven's sonata, which is built on thesis, antithesis, and coda as sublating synthesis, or even Bach's Fugue, its counterpoint construction, contain dialectics. Moreover, dialectical procedure in thought or speech is not necessarily only deductive, and together Jan Volker already spoken and described it, but it can as well be inductive, that is, unfold simultaneously with its emission, as the speech of Socrates before his death in Phaedo, or generally as oral thinking. In theater's New Testament, Jerzy Grotowski juxtaposes the holy actor's inductive technique and the courtesan actor's deductive devices. Due to inductive technique, the actor is able to reveal the psychic impulses and thinking impulses in statu nascendi, in the condition of emergence. And today we discussed that in dialectics, unlike some stereotypes, this statu nascendi development and evolving is also possible. Thus, in order to understand the proper distinction of how both procedures, the dialectical and non-dialectical, function, it is important to consider conditions and consequences of the application of each. What exactly does dialectics do that performativity cannot exert? And conversely, what does performance commit, which is absent in dialectics? I will endeavor to look upon the dialectical procedure from the point of view of Marxist cultural studies, and I will rely on socialist dialecticians, materialist dialecticians, which sometimes might not agree with Hegelian context. In it, the main necessity of dialectical procedure resides in three premises, and with these three premises, they were trying to argue with the structuralist construction and also with the positivist systemics, including cybernetic system, for instance. So first is genesis, time, diachronics is against the synchrony of a rigid and discrete structure, that is necessity to see phenomenon in its involution, in its antecedent relations and history. Second is the pretension that it is possible to grasp the sense, not значение, but смысл, the sense, reality and content by signification, which is impossible in structuralism and post-structuralism. And third, dialectical procedure, which is viewed as non-scientific, incommensurable, non-positivist speculation. And Jan perfectly described today wonderfully how it develops actually as inductive enunciation, which does not have denotative a rigid structure. For example, Vygotsky applied a genetic method in discerning the development of the higher mental functions in the lower ones. So this is the first method, right? When we try to see development retroactively to somehow inscribe development into the system. Or Merab Mamardashvili, also a thinker who dedicated most important text to Marx, looked at the capitalist semiology of commodity exchange as the synchronic system, and he tried it to unwind the hidden meaning of commodity form and expose its diachronic map. So they try to invade and intrude with diachronics into the rigid synchronic system. For example, Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, the psychologist, he made wonderful discoveries when he tried to discern lower forms of behavior and speech in the higher forms. He discerned the previous stages of symbolization in the emergence of inner speech. And he insisted that this inner speech has the same structure as Hegel's speculation, which is precisely based on this subject-subject proposition about which Jan talked, and not subject-predicate proposition. And therefore, this inner speech, so how the thinking is generated in a child, it has this dialectical construction, and it is not confined to mere intellect, but is as well evolution. So it is will. So this enabled Vygotsky to also claim that if it is not intellect, then the language and thinking are not the same. So thinking is not hinging on language, something that was so important for structuralists. And by these discoveries, these two discoveries, that inner speech speculation is also evolution, but at the same time, in its dialectical construction, thinking, this crazy thinking of a child when it conceives certain thoughts which are not linguistic, it enabled him to intrude into the construction of psyche and help to find the formula to overcome mental retardation and mental deviations. So again, the dialectical method helped him to discover his method. Second method, which I mentioned, is quite contradictory. It's in pretension to grasp the meaning by signifier. That is a counter-constructivist perspective and the claim that the signifier can transmit the signified. And as Marxist philosophers Ilyenkov, Mamardashvili show, such correspondence of a sign and a thing can only manifest in the conditions of the abolished private property and economics without surplus value. For Vygotsky, Ilyenkov, and Mamardashvili, the inference that sign and meaning could correlate, but that they cannot do so in capitalist conditions, is borrowed from Marxist premise that in capitalism, external manifestations of a thing cannot express the true relations. According to Vygotsky, therefore, without relatedness of a signifier to a concrete material activity or objecthood, the sense doesn't form. So this was different what was happening in socialist dialectics from generally what was happening in 60s and 70s in structuralism and Althusserian political thought. The necessity of the dimension of meaning, sense, which in case of rejection of the dialectic analysis is merely lost. In structuralism, conversely, or in the systems method, the signification was regarded as the only possible appearance of things and acts, and meaning or contents in them would be seen as essentialist. However, Marxist inspection of capitalist production is one such example of detecting the political economic contents hidden behind the external signs. And I would rely a little bit on Merab Mamardashvili's seminal text dedicated to verwandte Formen, Marxist verwandte Formen, converted forms on the need for irrational expressions, borrowed from Marxist critique. And here, quite like Vygotsky, he focuses on the importance of the dialectical analysis of a system when he manifests inability of capitalists' abstract semiology to retain the relevant genetic history of its components. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari referred to similar condition. They diagnosed the floating of capitalist signs without contents as schizophrenic. These are imaginary or quasi-objects torn from the drama of their genesis. However, there is difference in the outcomes which Deleuze and Guattari, on the one hand, and Mamardashvili on the other, obtained through their analysis of capitalist semiology. Deleuze and Guattari acknowledge the genetic dependence of a capitalist commodity on various modes of capitalist subsumption. However, in capitalism and schizophrenia, they are occupied rather with the capacity of the signs of capitalist production to tear their bonds with the relations that define them, so that they could soar into the new and autonomous creative assemblages. Whereas Mamardashvili tries to detect the causes of distortion behind the illusory semiosis. For example, Mamardashvili discovers that the products of capitalist process act as if they were its conditions. And in this case, the product pretends to be the reason. What is outcome pretends to stand in the beginning. And he shows that if this inversion is made and the sequence is reposited correctly, that is the result of the process is not the condition anymore, then the capacities of the system to reflect relations of production could be restored. In this example, we see that dialectics somehow hopes to struggle with the systems which make the meaning content redundant, inevitably complying with the hegemony of abstraction and presupposing that the detection of contacts beyond signifiers would imply simply idealism and metaphysics. And finally, I refer to the third method, which is precisely what Jan discussed, philosophic speculation, which is discussed by Hegel in the beginning of Phenomenology of Spirit, where he claims that philosophy has to use subject instead of subject-predicate proposition, which is simply a communicative judgment. He declines the discursive structure of denotation and insists that the concept, Begriff, can only elaborate through subject and substance, subject-subject speculation. And here is the same example that Jan brought, not A is B, but A is A1, A2, God is being, being is not a non-being, etc. Interestingly, again, referring to Vygotsky, for Vygotsky, internal speech becomes such non-denotative, inductive speculation. And here, in its internalization of the social phenomena, a special dialectical logical capacity develops, which tunes social phenomena as the Geist events. Somehow drawing them to cultural existentiality. Now let's skip to the performing procedure and try to see what is happening there that we cannot somehow make compatible to dialectics. For example, if we look at composition of Hamlet's to be or not to be, or articulation of the preposition cogito ergo sum, these are also performative procedures, can as well contain dialectical process, and the induction inherent in them, as we showed above, is not necessarily devoid of dialectics. In that case, if these performative utterances are both performative and dialectical, the question to ask is what precisely is added to utterance when it is performed? Apart from inductive speculation, which also can be enunciation, as Jan mentioned. In other words, we now have to discern what precisely in performing artistic process exceeds the dialectical procedure by definition. In this connection, it is important to emphasize that, for example, as Jerzy Grotowski mentions, the actor's performative behavior is not only inductive, it is also grounded in the impulse when the meaning of, it is not merely inductive, which means that it is grounded in the impulse when the meaning unfolds simultaneously with utterance. But actor's speech is as well playing the other than itself. In other words, whatever is said in the inductive mode is in addition also played, that is enacted in certain kind of excess. It is not simply a dictum of a philosopher or a poet. For example, in tragedy, the dictum is as well endowed with musical pitch or specific choreography. Or in performance, for instance, of Beethoven's sonata, which has absolutely dialectical form, even when its phrases are dialectically built, the performer during repetitive performing act adds to it certain supplementary components, which evolve as an excessive effort during performing. Or practice helps the performer to develop specific maniacal approaches which are added to the score, which are added to this dialectics. At this point, it is important to bring into our argument Deleuze's topology of event. Sorry, I'm skipping, but in his Logique du sens and difference and repetition, Deleuze develops a specific topology of event which he views through metaphor of actor's performance. He constantly gives this example of acting. When Deleuze speaks about event, he, quite like Vygotsky, insists on preserving the genesis, but ultimately, genesis of the event, but ultimately comes to different results. If in case of Vygotsky, certain phenomenon, while he detects its genesis, has to reveal its heuristic execution, in other words, its Bildung potentiality. In Deleuze's case, certain phenomenon has to find its performative articulation. Deleuze does not need Bildung. Once there is a performative outcome, sense can only be constructed performatively rather than being transmitted or attempt of the transmission by a signifier, as it is wrong to imply that the sense exists preliminarily somewhere. In Deleuze's performative topology, there are in fact two events. Rather than one. One of them, which he marks with a smaller case E, takes place in the depth of the happened, of the fatal encounters. And the second event, which is marked by capital E, becomes the performative transcendental effect to the depth of empirical ongoings. What is amazing here is that not only the lower event is empirical, but the transcendental one on the surface is empirical too. And once when I was listening to Ray Brassier's Zoom lectures, he also mentioned this issue of the empiricism of precisely transcendentality. If you want to see the research which deals with empiricism of transcendentality, you can as well see the Mark Rowley's book. In fact, transcendentality can reveal itself only through empirical effectuation. For Deleuze, everything that comes onto the surface as the performative reaction to factual events, while being the genetic consequence to preceding facts, for instance, someone hit me or I underwent through certain catastrophe, becomes nevertheless the paradoxical element arising thanks to an exit from the thickness of bodies and exit from the depth of the world. Now, when someone hits me, then I skip out on the surface, and instead of retelling what happened, I am reacting performatively on it in a paradoxic way. The event capitalized, in contrast to the event smaller case, is not merely narrating something, but it is effect of it. Effect is to exceed the catastrophe with a paradoxical something that imprints itself as an abstract line on the surface above what happened. The nonsense, paradox, ethereal signs, and smile without a cat are the event with uppercase leaping out of the depth of facts onto the surface. The metaphor for this can be the rope walker of Nietzsche. The rope walker moves further, each step leads to effectuation, but below there is an abyss. And it is on top of the rope that the empirical anthropometry of movement evolves. First step, second, third, up to the end of the walk. Movement unfolds within the seizure of the chronological duration of time. Each music piece or each theatrical tragedy is such seizure of time. Body, in this case, is as well incorporeal, as it stops to be simply the organism. In that case, Oedipus kills his father and Mary's mother as the lowercase event, but he blinds himself and becomes a poet as the uppercase event. Similarly, Christ is slapped on his face by Pilatus as the lowercase event in the depth of the facts, but he protrudes performatively his second cheek as the uppercase event. As suprabeing, the death of Antigone's brothers happens in lowercase event, but her persistent performance and demonstrative choice of death when she chooses it after burial of them performatively is second plane. Lacan calls this dimension second death, which he compares to the transformation of ethical deed into beauty. Deleuze calls it the third repetition of death, or the timeline of tragedy. In his Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche calls such paradoxic, unexpected subversion in relation to the happened as aesthetic play. Thus, Deleuze, although he constantly repeats that event has genesis, nevertheless, quite like Nietzsche, does not trust the possibility of revealing the meaning, as Vygotsky, Mamardashvili, or Marx do. Dialectical procedure is, of course, incommensurable, as Jan described wonderfully. But even in its unfolding as the quid pro quo logic, and I think that he also talked about otherness, and quid pro quo is very important in this networking of dialectics. It needs certain coherence, whereas performative act as event is emitting signs as something paradoxically incompatible to the happened. Performing arts are grounded in such paradoxality, although they might contain dialectical constructs too. And Deleuze has many definitions for this performative dimension of event. Third repetition of death, aeon, temporality of caesura, supra-being, counter-effectuation, nonsense. In this complementary performative temporality, the words, the speech are important, but they appear speech, gesture, plastic curve. Now, one of the main reasons why Deleuze cannot rely on transmission of what happened, or on expression of meaning, on expression of sense, at least certain expression of sense, is that while unwinding the genesis, what reveals itself in performance, what emerges from the depth of the happened to the surface of evental facts will always be changing on its way in the course of such procedure. And Deleuze often reminds us, on refoule parce qu'on répète. What one repeats or performs is ousted. The more one repeats, the more one loses the bond with the content, which cannot be known. In other words, during transit from empirical factuality to supra-being, the very contents changes. Moreover, what leaps out on the surface acquires supplementary performative parameters which transform the contents semantically. That's why a word or sign differs from a thing rather than corresponds with it, no matter how persistently it might try to repeat it. For example, performative pieces show this very well. Actually, opera was invented through this paradoxality of impossibility to connect with the event, because the initial pitch musical outburst, it is rather the paradoxic syndrome of repetition rather than any reaction on any narrative reaction on catastrophe. When Deleuze dedicates a section in his Difference and Repetition to Descartes' Cogito, he tries to show that even this philosophic phrase is uttered as performative repetition in the transcendental virtuality of aeon, temporality after seizure of chronic time. Yes, this phrase is inductive. It has been thought through as it was being emitted. For Deleuze, cogito is approached as the performed repetition as well, because as Mark Rowley tries to show, thought is evental when it does not externalize itself to be sublated in a concept. It is intensity, but remains inside its own effectuation and remains inside of its own effectuation. Deleuze claims that he finds Descartes' logical leap between thinking and being too drastic and merely semantic, and that this shift from thinking to being should imply as well temporal component. Apart from that, this phrase, quite like performative repetition, takes place after caesura, in the supplementary temporality. Like all artworks, they don't take place in our everyday, but they add certain transcendental temporality for themselves. Not the time in which we exist, but the time in which we step out from chronic temporality to exert performative act. Deleuze adds that such is the temporality in which Oedipus finds himself after his blinding. And now I come to the last and crucial point. To sum up, for Deleuze, performative articulation of event is inevitable. Because performative repetition is a syndrome, one inevitably repeats the happened performatively. Because, as we said, it will never be known. It is impossible to know what precisely happened on the refoule parce qu'on répète. This performative excessive conduct unfolds in the temporal gap between being and non-being, often under the peril of dying. That's why Deleuze talks about tragedy constantly when he deals with third repetition. And the examples that we gave are from tragedies as well: Antigone, Oedipus, Hamlet, Descartes. Now the question is whether a dialectician would treat the similar condition, the fatal happening, differently. And this is where we come to Socrates. Socrates is almost in a similar condition as the above listed protagonists of tragedies. He faces execution. In Phaedo, Plato literally maps the last hours before his death. Yet his feedback to it has nothing performative in it. The question would then be, why isn't the death of Socrates performative? For Socrates, even the agony of dying, when he has already taken the poison in the presence of his disciples, does not cancel dialectical speculation. It's processuality of quid pro quo. If for Deleuze the mode of dying which fosters performative repetition exceeds dialectical speculation, for Socrates, on the contrary, even dying should remain dialectical. The standpoint of Socrates and hence of Plato or of the Marxist dialecticians, which I already mentioned, Vygotsky or Ewald Ilyenkov, would be that even in the conditions between life and death, it is possible to reveal the sense in the signification. A dialectician chooses not to reside in the empirical depths, quite like Deleuze, but if Deleuze's performative event with capital E leaps out of empirical depth onto the second étage, the surface, onto the time of aeon to unfold performatively, a dialectician, on the contrary, draws the aeon, the transcendental, the ideal, down towards the ontic factographic reality. And this is my inference. I cannot insist on this, and I will show you this very childish drawing by me because I need probably a graphic designer to make it in a better way. So you see this line, and you see certain kind of things happening in the depth. But then there is performative outburst or reaction, which in case of Deleuze situates itself on the surplus as figures, as transcendental asignification. This is Deleuze's case, and when he speaks about event, he differs from Guattari, to my mind. It's another issue, but I think so. But then there is total aleatorics, like Pierre Boulez's music, or generally seriality, which already loses any genesis. So those figures that you see higher, these are just those crazy, serial, absolutely contingent things that are totally torn in schizophrenic way. But so what is the dialectician doing, or at least the socialist dialecticians? They try to draw these transcendental ideas down precisely into the everyday. And what happens in this case? A dialectician chooses not to reside in the empirical depths, but if Deleuze's performative event with capital E leaps on the second étage, a dialectician draws aeon down, as I said. In this case, something evental has, on the contrary, to submerge in the daily. It has to embed the daily so that it is the daily that is seen as evental in its entirety. In that case, the singularity, the exceptional, is not confined to performative artistic act. It has to become constant. For example, Descendants of Christ is a singular evental act, but it is as well dissipated in the everyday and becomes constant for a believer. Whereas Deleuze's event with capital E, it leaps on the surface and reminds us an artwork, a concert, a play. Moreover, French or October Revolution are singular events. They used to be singular events, but in the turnover capitalism, they appear as constant imprint in ontology and epistemology. In that case, for a dialectician, maybe it's also my inference, we speak not so much of event, but of metanoia, a transformative change of mind, a conceptual conversion of consciousness. It is like a conversion of soul into pole. In that case, nothing changes literally in terms of interfaces, in terms of signification, as pole does not look or move different from soul, but he nevertheless is another person. What will change will be the activity mindset, Bildung, and the root of development. Consequently, the semiological rendering of metanoia has to be different from the rendering of evental effectuation. In case of Deleuzean performative repetition of event, the body has to become the idea. As I showed, these figures are on the surface. The strange nonsensical diagram, and it is this transcendental becoming that empirically and almost anthropometrically evolves. But in case of metanoia, the idea, the logos, acquires the body. Christ acquires daily body. Socrates embodies the philosophic approach to dying by his elementary, non-performative conduct. Revolution's aftermath or politeconomic consequences have to embed themselves also in daily sociality. In the first case, empirical event has to distill itself. In case of Deleuze, it distills itself in the incorporeal abstract line, crystallizing as event, emerging from depth on surface. And in the second case of dialectics, the concept idea is already in the ontic material being. I had an example from Tarkovsky, but probably I will end here. Thank you.